let me note that education.org has been one of the leaders worldwide in this initiative that some of us call knowledge brokering, others call knowledge bridging, connecting, learning engineering, a lot of terms, but basically, how do we take the science of learning and make sure that it's not only translated, but practically applied, and particularly in the context and the uniqueness that is each of our regions, nations, and cultures. And so I just want to thank Dr. Suzanne Grant Lewis very much with education.org. Education.org has published a white paper that I recommend if you haven't seen, calling for an education knowledge bridge, evidence use in education. Also, Dr. Lewis has been active in education.org in what they call accelerated education programs. So what definition do you use of whether you call it knowledge brokering, bridging, connecting?
Thank you very much, Bob, for the opportunity. So very broadly, as you indicated, for education.org, knowledge brokering means bridge building to try to reduce the gap between what we know and what we do in education. And for us, we think about, having the right people, right content at the right time, place, and on the right channel. So when we talk about right people, it means purposefully matching individuals and groups around a specific need or needs that's very goal-oriented, so convening of policy and practice leaders. The right content, so here we're really emphasizing user-centered content, action-oriented, context-specific, including a wide range of sources, and then right time. As we know about research pickup, timing is really important, but also to our place and channel. So we're working to have tailored engagement and communications to facilitate the transfer of evidence into policies and practices. So for us, knowledge brokering, or building the knowledge bridge, is a means to an end. And our main mission is to advance evidence and improve education for all learners. It's very broad, but we really, more specifically, we do this by making existing evidence easier for education leaders to access and use, and to integrate that into policies, plans, and guidelines. So our focus is on the use of existing research and other forms of evidence. I think one important point from our perspective is that it's not acontextual, although we are developing, as part of this knowledge bridging, knowledge brokering, we're developing global goods like evidence syntheses. And we recognize you have to pay attention to the context and therefore present the evidence for those users in ways in which they can contextualize it. Brokering particularly, you have to remember you're dealing with decision makers working in their own context. So for us, we've got, I could highlight like 7 lines of work. First, you need to identify the concerns of those end users. For us, they're decision makers, especially policy makers and their teams in the global South in ministries of education. So these are our top users, and they always have to be top of mind, because the knowledge brokering is to serve them. I think a second element of our work is to bridge the knowledge producers, particularly those traditional academics, researchers, etc., with the decision makers. A third line that we're working on is to broaden the range of evidence that's used. So we're really working for a more inclusive definition of what is evidence in education. So we want to include the work of practitioners, local evidence, stuff that is often not finding its way into published channels, traditionally published work. And we particularly want to amplify the work of those local researchers and practitioners, because it's often invisible, and yet in the views of, as we hear from decision makers, it's often the most valuable. So that's, and then we work to translate that global evidence into a synthesis that can be adjusted for local contexts. And you mentioned our accelerated education program. So that's our prototype evidence synthesis. It came out in September, along with a high-level brief. So another line of our work is to to strengthen evidence infrastructure. And I think with knowledge brokering, you have to consider this. And this is things like the capacity of individuals, institutional arrangements, culture, by which I mean, incentives. And white paper talks a lot about the culture of evidence in the health sector. And in our world, I think there's still a lot of work to be done to kind of strengthen the culture of evidence in decision-making arenas. And then finally, we are working to support the use of evidence and its integration into sector plans, policies, and practices. So that's how we think broadly and what it means for the lines of work that we're following, as all as part of building the knowledge bridge, or knowledge brokering, as you call it.
So you spoke in the very beginning about context. Context matters. Education.org is working in a large swath of the world. How do you go from the macro to the micro, from the broad to the narrow application?
So we're a very young organization. So we're in our first 3 years, and we are in developing this prototype of the evidence synthesis. It was both a prototype of the process and a prototype product. And for this first one, we drew from global set of evidence, but I'd say we went particularly deep on 8 sub-Saharan African countries. And when we move towards the actual uptake and integration, we're actually trying out those lines of work, and particularly in Kenya and in Sierra Leone at the moment, in which we've got multi-year arrangements to work together to help strengthen the infrastructure and integrate evidence into policies, plans, and guidelines or guidance. So at the moment, I wouldn't say we have a global focus. We're working towards that, but we drew evidence for this first one from lots of places, but it's a prototype. So we know that we had to have some narrow deep dive, which we did. So I think that'll change over time.
Are there organizations that you'd recommend we look at as well that are doing this in other parts?
Yes, so there are a number of what we'd call comparators, because we, of course, wanted, as we worked on the white paper, which you referenced, but we're now revisiting that because we're trying to build on the work of others in this area of what we call inclusive evidence, expanding beyond what is published in journals and books, et cetera, to have a broader definition of evidence, particularly that coming out of gray literature, stuff that's not published through traditional channels. And so that's causing us to revisit. Okay, so I have top of my mind a number of examples that I could refer you to. So the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3IE, has very, very interesting work. But they tend to really focus on impact evaluations as the main basis for that. So some of these examples are defining evidence in certain ways. Then there's an initiative that's called the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel, or GEEAP. It's co-hosted by the British bilateral FCDO, the DFID, World Bank, UNICEF, and they put out their first report, which is on smart buys. And there, again, they have a particular definition of what's rigorous, high quality research. So those are good. Those are examples of organizations that are trying to influence policy and practice. They're not the second one. GEEAP is not the co-hosting or sponsoring organizations are working through their ongoing country relations to try to influence things, but it's a little bit different, and they have particular definitions of what's knowledge or evidence. Within the US and UK, I think of Education Endowment Foundation, the EEF. They are so they only draw on US and UK evidence, but they have they're really tied to influencing practice, and it's very interesting way that they present their evidence summaries. So that's worth a look. But one of the barriers is language, right? So in one of the compromises we made for our first prototype evidence synthesis was just English language sources. But an exception to that is SUMMA, all caps SUMMA. It's a laboratory of education research and innovation in for Latin America and the Caribbean. And they work in multiple languages because they're serving countries that have different languages. And their big emphasis is less on the knowledge production and more on that brokering. So I would say that's definitely an organization worth looking at.
It's one thing to be developing the information. It's putting it in a form that people can readily use. Some have suggested or questioned whether there's a need to actually be developing some sort of cadre or core group of people that can serve this function, whether they be teachers, educators, others. Thoughts on that? Yeah,
I think one of the skill sets that we find is not so common is the translation. Is so much of the evidence reviews, systematic reviews or evidence syntheses are written for researchers who are then going to build on, it's going to inform their next set of research questions, what have you. And some of them are written for, in the development world, you call it donors. People are going to fund future research, right? There's enough, we don't find things that are really synthesized for decision makers, for policy makers, and the people who actually have to allocate government resources to make and choose strategies. So that's a niche that we're trying to fill. And when we shared our first draft of the evidence synthesis, we sent it out for review, and it was really interesting that people still didn't quite get it. The capturing of it and messaging for decision makers. And we were aiming to identify some of the policy options and the next steps, and to give a framework or a tool for deciding on the next steps, because this synthesis is meant to serve across a wide range of countries that are either trying to strengthen accelerated education programs or better coordinate them, or thinking about investing in them, right? So they need to know, well, okay, what's known and what do we do as decision makers? And that's a different kind of set of writing. If G. Solon decides that it's classroom practitioners you're trying to influence, which I know is a focus, you need to be sure that you're writing in ways that meeting their needs, really responding to how they see the world and how, they will take up that information.
So is education.org's emphasis right now on the decision maker?
Yes. Yeah.
Because I agree with you. In many ways, that's vitally important, because while you always want good practice, but good practice should shape good policy, and then good policy can in turn leverage in that practice.
Yeah.
But it's also, my experience tells me that it's a different type of messaging often.
Yes.
Because the policymaker may or may not ever have been in a classroom, and in many of the cases will not have been. And so, and also responds to the certain appeals and messages that are necessary for a policymaker that may differ from that of the practitioner.
Yeah, that's true. And so when we start an evidence synthesis, we have to think about the questions that policymaker would have. Everything from, well, what works? What do we know about it working in a context similar to the one in my country? What kind of capacity, human resources are required? What kind of financial resources are required? How long is this going to take? Because many policymakers are elected and have a set term in office, and they're not interested in the 10-year. Let
me say, nothing narrows your focus as much as a 2-year term.
Well, 2 years, very short. Yeah, so that's it. So we are sort of consulting a lot with these end users to ensure that we understand their perspective, but also we will continue to do that for selection of topics, the areas that they're really grappling with and need answers to. And any given topic, we'll have those consultations to make sure that the kinds of questions they have, we're trying to kind of translate what the evidence says to answer those questions. And it's very
So,
different than a researcher's perspective.
so for a researcher who's
Mm.
saying, how does my evidence get used? Can you give a practical example of something you might be working on that demonstrates this?
Sure. So there was very fortunate timing that we've been working in Kenya for some time, and Kenya has experience with a number of accelerated education programs, but they're all designed, the government role has been limited, a little bit of involvement in one or two, but they've all been kind of designed by the funder of that program. So some are in refugee camps, some are elsewhere, and they weren't coordinated, and there was no tie-in to government equity and inclusion goals. So the timing worked extremely well. The government had already decided it needed to have some guidelines, and then we were able to feed the evidence synthesis that we had done with examples from lots of different countries of policies and guidelines, et cetera, to better inform the guidelines that the Kenyan government is developing. And eventually there'll be a policy on this. So that was extremely fortunate but impactful way that we were able to inform the work that the government had decided on. In Sierra Leone, big emphasis of these accelerated programs for girls, and they had the Ebola experience, which actually helped them in some ways to deal with or know what to expect with the closures from COVID. But they have a really very strong inclusion policy framework. It's not just in education. And so they see the accelerated education programs as a way to ensure the most marginalized get in. And so we're working with them to say, okay, so to even more contextualize this evidence synthesis for their work.
Do you have suggestions for how GSOLN might help advance this, promoting your work and highlighting? We're looking to how can we support these initiatives?
So I think you have a special niche, on the science of learning, and I think you do well to partner and really focus on the sharing of what you're finding, so that you can partner with others to help with that translation. Our end users very different than classroom-based practitioners, so you need to decide who are you really focused on, and then partner with other organizations that are working in that area. I think the intellectual power of GSOLN is really impressive, and I think finding those outlets. Our own experiences partnering. I mean, we're quite small and very young, and our impact is expanded by working with others.
We believe in complementing and supporting, not competing, and looking to see where it is that we can lift up what others are doing and make that available so that people can take advantage of it. And then where is there a need that we can be pointing to? So,
Great.
So any